Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to TechGig webinar series, our endeavor to empower techies. We believe that sharing of knowledge is the key to enhance our skills and grow us as professionals. With this principle in mind, we have initiated a series of webinars conducted by industry experts to give you all a crisp insight of various domains. The topic of today's session is story-based automation using free tools. Our guest speaker today is Mr. Paul Gerrard, Principal, Unicom Gerrard Testing. Paul has 30 years experience as a consultant, teacher, author, webmaster, programmer, tester, conference speaker, a rowing coach, and a publisher. He has conducted consulting assignments in all aspects of software testing and QA, specializing in test strategy, assurance, and automation. In 2010, he won the Eurostar European Testing Excellence Award. Paul would be there in India in July 2013. He is a speaker at the World Conference Next Generation Testing. So all of you who would be in Bangalore at that time can surely go and meet him. So without further delay, I introduce you all to our guest speaker. Over to you, Paul.
Thank you, Mahini. I think can you tell me if there's any problem with my screen? I think I'm ready to go now. Okay, so here I am. I'm here to talk about some technology that we've been working on for about two and a half years now, and how we can use our product, Business Story Manager, and a subset of the functionality, what we've called Story Platform for QA, to manage requirements and stories and scenarios in an agile way, and to hand over those scenarios to a software product called Robot Framework, which is an open source test automation framework, and in particular to drive websites using the Selenium, now known as WebDriver kind of library, if you like. Everything I'm talking about is summarized in the Business Story Pocketbook, which Susan Windsor and myself wrote about a year ago now, which you can download. If you follow the links to the websites, you can actually get a copy of the Pocketbook as a PDF for free. No problem. So, okay, so that's the summary. Let me just... oops. There we go. Right. Let me just walk through what I want to talk about for the next half an hour or so. In summary, behavior-driven development is an approach to software development and design and development, which is becoming more and more popular in the Agile community, certainly, but is also beginning to emerge as an opportunity for more structured and what you might know as waterfall products. It's not quite such an easy fit, but behavior-driven development is a way of taking the test-driven approach for developers and making it more business, user, value-oriented, so that stories captured with stakeholders, users, if you like, can be used because they are in a structured format. They can be used to drive test automation and thereby introduce the developers into their test-driven approach in quite a slick and elegant way. Now, I'm not going to talk about in great detail about behavior-driven development. I will summarize it in the next slide or so, but the benefits to developers are great in that it gives them a much cleaner interface with businesses in terms of developing software to deliver features and functionality required by end users, but in using the mechanism of stories to drive that process. So for developers, it's great. Now, it's interesting that although the focus of behavior-driven development has in the past been on the test automation side, and I'm going to talk about that obviously shortly, the people who promote behavior-driven development are now talking more and more about the collaboration between stakeholders, business analysts, testers, developers, in order to define the stories themselves. So I think what you'll hear more and more is behavior-driven development moving up the kind of life cycle towards requirements and analysis. Now, right now, the software products that support behavior-driven development they're kind of developer-focused. In effect, they provide the connection between stories and test automation code, but because the developers kind of own that process, that transformation, the stories tend to be managed by the developers themselves. So the tools are developer-focused. The approach to date has been rather too developer-focused, and because they are geared towards driving development through stories, every story is kind of an independent piece of work, if you like. So the tools aren't really yet designed to handle larger numbers of stories to larger requirement spaces, and they're also very atomic. So the stories themselves are all kind of equivalent, and I've heard tales of teams running projects with hundreds or even thousands of stories, all in independent text files in a single directory. So that's an extreme case, but it's clear that the tools are now popular enough to have momentum and to be implemented out there, but they haven't evolved as quickly as perhaps the thinking has. So the tools themselves don't support the collaborative working that actually behavior-driven development is really all about. So what I want to talk about today really is not to undermine BDD, but rather to say we can support that approach. And as often as not, you can hear people talk about acceptance test-driven development as well as behavior-driven development. We tend to sort of talk more likely about acceptance-driven. That is, it's the acceptance criteria or the scenarios associated with stories that actually drive the development and then subsequent test process. So today I want to talk about our product Story Platform for QA, which is a subset of Business Story Manager. Story Platform for QA is a free service we're making available on the internet, and how that connects with Robot Framework to implement an acceptance-driven approach. Just for your reference, if you're not so familiar with behavior-driven development, there's a couple of links here. Our Wikipedia, if you do a search there, there's a good list of links to further information from there. Also, I'm going to talk briefly about requirements and test hierarchies when I look further into the tools themselves. And businessstorymanager.com is the website for the overall product, and there are some videos there which will explain how requirements and stories can be created and drive the process. So there's more detail on businessstorymanager.com. So let me just introduce very quickly behavior-driven development using current tools, just to give you a sense of how these things work. I've no doubt some of you are already familiar with this, but maybe some of you aren't. So let me just do this fairly quickly. The principle is this: the source of knowledge for a requirement is captured in a story, which is in a structured language. There are several formats, but the most popular, most likely format out there is Gherkin. And the story itself is some structured text, and the text itself would contain a definition of a feature, and there would be a name, and then the feature would be described in terms of as a role of some kind. I want, which is what I want from that feature, what I want to do, so that, or in order that, is the third angle, which is the why I want it. So what the structured story really indicates for a feature is who wants it, what they want, and why they want it. So these three dimensions. Now beneath that, there are a whole series of scenarios which illustrate how that feature would be used. And the structure of those clauses in a story, if you like, has a pattern of given, when, then. Given some situation, some current state, is the first clause. When the user does something, some event occurs, and then the third aspect is the then clause. What is the outcome of the current situation plus some kind of stimulation to the software? What is the outcome? So given, when, then are like preconditions, steps, and postconditions. In many respects, it's like a test case in the traditional way you might think of test cases. So scenarios are completely familiar to testers and the way that they think in terms of, now, business stories are written in business language and they relate directly to requirements. So they're not executable as pieces of software, but they are understandable as examples of features in use. So because they're in business language, they are still recognizable by users and stakeholders, but they need to be transformed into formal test cases if you're going to automate them. And I'm going to walk through that process now. So in the diagram you can see this the story, and we take a BDD tool, and the most popular, the best known I think is Cucumber nowadays. But there are quite a few others now, maybe six or even more now. JBehave, RSpec, SpecFlow, and others have a BDD kind of component. What the BDD tool does is it interprets the text of the story and generates what you would then recognize as some test code. So with Cucumber, it uses the Ruby language, so it actually generates some Ruby code. Now, that's great if you're a Ruby programmer, but not so great if you're not a Ruby programmer, okay? But let's move on anyway. So the BDD tool generates some test code, which looks like some automatable test code. However, you still need the fixtures or test step definitions to connect the test code that's generated to the system under test. Obviously, a story might say, the user confirms a transaction on a screen maybe. Well, that's not enough information to identify a button that must be clicked on a web page. So the test fixtures provide that kind of definition. Where there are keywords used in the story, the fixtures, keyword definitions, test step definitions provide the translation into some physical activity on the system under test. So okay, so now we've got some generated test code. We create our test fixtures, test step definitions, keyword definitions, whatever. Different technologies have different names for these things. And we can execute the test on the system under test using the BDD tool or a library that is connected to the BDD tool. So this could be a Selenium library, or it could be a library to drive Windows, VB applications, that kind of thing. And there are many libraries out there now to test almost every platform you can imagine. So we can run a test which generates test outcomes. The developer who is taking these tests and running these tests knows that when they run them the first time, they will fail, of course, because the system under test, the feature under test, does not yet exist. So what the process becomes is the developer runs the tests, looks at the outcomes, and then creates code, writes code, and manages and edits the code to pass the tests. So this kind of cycle of activity of test fails, change the code, run the test passes. This cycle evolves, allows the developer to evolve the software itself. Now these tests are checks, if you like. They are not very sophisticated tests. Let's not get too carried away. They're not end-to-end tests. They are very much focused on the features under development. But the notion of test automation at a feature level, at a story level, allows developers to adopt the test-driven approach. So the nature of this would be the test. When the tests pass, the developer then, you would expect to refactor the code. So as the code evolves to pass all the tests, usually there's a final phase of development to refactor, to redesign, to tidy up loose ends and so on and so forth, and make the code slightly of higher quality. But the tests themselves provide a regression safety net, if you like, for them to do this. So BDD at the moment works this way. Now the benefit to developers is they can use it to drive the test-driven approach. But what BDD provides essentially is it allows the collaboration between business stakeholders, testers and developers and analysts to derive requirements that have meaning, and the transformation into test code is something that the technical people can do. So this encourages the collaboration in an Agile project, but it's kind of universal. It's emerging as an opportunity for all project types. Now, the beauty of using structured stories, which are recognizable by business users in business language, in their domain-specific language, is that it encourages the developers to write their test code and to write the software using the same, if you like, words and names for entities and functions and features as was used in the requirements. So BDD encourages the use of domain-specific language right throughout the requirements through to code. And the buzzword that you'll hear quite a lot about, increasingly I think, is this concept of ubiquitous language. That is, the language used in requirements could be recognized even down to the code level. And this kind of encourages better communication throughout our project between business people and technical people. The problem is that the current tools only really support the test automation side of this process. They don't really provide a lot of support to the collaboration side between the business analysts, testers and developers. So what we've been promoting for a couple of years now is an approach which is broader than the rather limited BDD approach, to say, well, wait a minute, non-trivial systems need a set of requirements that are more comprehensive, the business rules themselves, that are more comprehensive than just stories. And our argument, which I can't go into too much detail now, but our argument is that you need requirements and you need stories. And the stories provide two major benefits on top of the requirements. Firstly, they example and illustrate the requirements so they can be used as a feedback mechanism to validate requirements. And when the requirements and the stories are aligned and there's comfort that the requirements and stories are accurate, those stories can be reused to drive the behavior-driven approach. So in Business Story Manager and this story platform for QA, which is what I want to show you, we have a requirements module which allows you to create textual requirements formatted in any reasonable way, and provides a hierarchy of requirements too. Now beneath that we can create stories which identify features which are aligned with those requirements. And it's arguable whether the requirement comes first and then the story comes along second, or the story comes first and the requirements are derived. It's kind of cyclical and iterative. In many ways, users will tell you a story when you ask them what they want, but to capture the rules of the process that they describe in their stories, you need a more formal language and a defined business rule to provide the generalizations that stories quite often don't give you. So requirements and stories are fundamental to what's in the product. We also have a module which manages a thing called the dictionary, which I'm not going to go into detail about, but it basically holds, it registers all your terminology, a glossary of your terminology, and indexes the use of that language in requirements, in stories, and in scenarios, and therefore tests. So the dictionary provides a navigable index, a bit like Google for your requirements, for your knowledge base. Okay, so that's what the dictionary does. I can't talk about that today, another day, I think. So, okay, so we have our structured stories, and we have a feature to export those stories in a range of formats. Okay, initially, we're looking at generating test cases in a format that Robot Framework would recognize. So in effect, what we've got is we have a requirements hierarchy, stories aligned with individual requirements, scenarios which example the features in those stories, and those scenarios can be exported in a format that Robot Framework would recognize. Now, just like the BDD process I showed you a couple of slides ago, the test cases in Robot Framework format require definitions. So we have a resource file, typically, which provides the translations of keywords into, in effect, Selenium or WebDriver kind of commands to drive the system of the test. The beauty of Robot Framework is it has a WebDriver Selenium library for handling websites, but there are many other libraries, and that's why we found it attractive to look at Robot Framework initially. Now, once the test cases exist, the keyword definitions exist, you can run your tests against the system under test. Now, in principle, we have exactly the same process. We have a series of outcomes and outputs and a status of all our tests to allow developers to build the product, but also we're building a platform, a regression testing platform, as a natural outcome of working with requirements and stories in this way. Now, the output of those tests, once the software is trusted and passes the test, we can pass that status back into SpeedUp QA. So we can report progress against individual scenarios, stories, and requirements in SpeedUp QA. So we can connect, and we have that feedback loop between tests run at a relatively low level against requirements which might be at a very high level. So we can provide that traceability between one and the other. Let's look at the relationship between Business Story Manager and test frameworks in general. Is what I've shown you there is this relationship between requirements and stories. And to the left, something I haven't mentioned is a concept of business goals as well. So we have like a goal network and a risk management module as well in Business Story Manager. That's beyond what I want to talk about today. But we can trace a path right from business goals to requirements to stories to generated story-based test cases. They're generated. We have manually maintained resource files which provide the translations. And for Robot Framework, this is a natural way of the architecture working. Robot Framework has multiple drivers for different technologies, and the log from the execution of tests in Robot Framework in particular, but in any framework tool, can be fed back into Business Story Manager to close the loop, to provide that feedback loop between a requirement and maybe even a business goal itself and the tests of software that support that business goal. So that's the vision for frameworks in the future, and right now we've have the interface to Robot Framework. So that's enough of the theory. Let me just walk you through the process as we're intending to use it and how we use the product SpeedUp QA. I should say that the SpeedUp QA is the actual URL. It's a very short URL, so we're quite pleased we got hold of that. You can see some images and some explanations of how the process works on the website, sp.qa. Okay, so let's start with the requirements. So these are a series of screenshots I'm going to show you. I can't. It's a bit too risky to do live demos on webinars, I think. I'm not brave enough to do that yet. So I'm going to show you some screenshots of the products, but these are real screenshots, and we can show you a live demo if you're interested in the future. On the left, you have a hierarchy, the tree of requirements, and you can see the requirement I've highlighted, input lucky numbers ticket. Okay, so this is a feature of a dummy applications we've created for the purpose of demonstrations, but also our own testing, I should say. Input lucky numbers ticket is a screen allowing you to submit a ticket to a national lottery. So this feature is one of many within the whole lottery system. So you can have a hierarchy of requirements, and as you look to the right, the definition of this particular requirement is there in detail on the right. So that's a requirement description. If I move to the next slide, I'm looking now at a feature which is described in one of the stories that reference that input lucky numbers ticket requirement. So on the left, you can see the feature identified, and on the right, you can see, it's rather small, I'm afraid, but you can see the detail of the story, which has as a lottery ticket retailer, I want to enter a lottery ticket so that the ticket is registered on the system. So this is the as a I want so that format, you can see. So now we have a feature. Now beneath the feature, if we go to the next slide, I can look at one of the scenarios. And one of the scenarios is describes invalid ticket entry, invalid tickets. So to the right, you can see the given when then format of the scenario. Given the ticket has numbers in angle brackets. When the ticket is scanned, then the ticket is accepted, accept, reject, and message is displayed. Okay, so the text enclosed in angle brackets refer to placeholders for data. So in effect, this scenario, sometimes called a scenario outline, is a template for a series of scenarios into which you can substitute data. So the data just beneath the scenario itself has 3 columns. You can see numbers, accept, reject, and message. This is the text of the data that should be substituted into the scenario. So if you like, these business scenarios are data-driven. Okay, so, and this is a kind of a more compact way of describing scenarios rather than having many more complex scenarios. So there are usually patterns which we can rationalize and refactor our scenarios into tabulated examples which can drive a scenario outline. Okay, so that's the hierarchy from requirements through to scenarios and the data. And I've kind of skipped a step, and there's a subtle kind of change happens in the system in that we have this concept of locking of requirements and stories. When you lock a story, the business scenario is frozen in time and you cannot change it. However, the scenarios for those locked stories are copied into what we call test scenarios. And the test scenarios allow you to put in the additional detail required in order to drive a website or an application of some description. So what you have here is a test scenario which relates to to a valid ticket. I think in this case, a valid ticket on the feature input lottery ticket. So there's lots of color coding going on, and the color coding refers to 2 things mainly. The blue color coding identifies the placeholders for data, the data items themselves, and you can see there's a table towards the bottom of the screen. There's just one test case here, one example, one test case here. The orange and green highlighting is the dictionary doing its job. It identifies words that are defined in the dictionary. Okay, so I'm not going to talk much more about the dictionary at all, but that's what the color coding refers to. Okay, so if you like, we've got the hierarchy, we've got scenarios, business scenarios, we've also got test scenarios which logically provide you a set of test cases that in principle you could print them out and hand them over to an individual and saying, go and run these tests. They're story level, they're feature driven tests, they're kind of low level, but that's possible. So that's where we're at so far. So let me just take a moment to look at the actual application of the test, just to give you a sense of how the examples work. The Lucky Numbers application has half a dozen features. Yeah, one is register to play games. You can create your ticket, and essentially what's required are 5 numbers as a bonus number, and a number of times you want to play week in, week out. You can view your gameplays, you can change your profile, reset your password, and so on. It's a very simple application, but it has enough functionality for us to use it for our purposes to test, but also to demonstrate. So this is the submit your play screen. Looks fairly simple. And when you submit a valid play, you get a report, basically a screen advising you that the play has been successful, you've got your ticket into the system, and so on. So it's a simple little application, a little toy application we use. So that's really just to explain how the examples I've shown you relate to a real piece of software. Now, Story Platform for QA has the requirements, stories, scenarios, and test scenarios. There's a process within the tool to export your test scenarios. So let me just show you that very quickly. In Robot Framework on the test module, sorry, in SpeedUp QA in the test module, I beg your pardon, there's like a ribbon arrangement, and you can see the Robot Framework ribbon there, and I've highlighted the Export Robot Test Cases button. When you click on that, you see a screen like this. Now, I've just shown you one scenario to be exported, the example I showed you on the previous screen. Normally, all the scenarios for stories that are locked are available to export. So locking allows you to go, triggers this process, if you like. Now, I can export the stories in Windows or Linux or Macintosh format. I can also use more than one mechanism to get the data out. So I can, what we found very convenient is to use Dropbox to export files into Dropbox accounts. We can also zip these files up and send them through email to you as well, and that works very quickly indeed. But I want to show you how the Dropbox connection works. It's just more elegant, if you like. So, okay, so when I click on the Export Robot Test Cases, and then redirect it to my Dropbox account, which will ask me the question, do I want to authorize Business Story Manager to put files in my Dropbox account? And you accept, you allow that, of course. And then the process happens, and I can't show you a sort of a moving image of how this actually works, but the process, Business Story Manager, Story Platform for QA, places files in your Dropbox directory that you have control over. And in this case, I've exported 4. So this is a listing of what's in the Dropbox directory. Okay. So having done that, I can now go to Dropbox, and personally, I choose to work within my Dropbox account with it to manage my tests and to run my tests and capture results too. So this is an Explorer list of the 4 files in my robots directory, and you can see input ticket.txt is the first one. The 4 zeros, I'm not going to talk about this, but these are sequence numbers that you can use to drive the sequence of test execution if you choose to. But I have input ticket.txt, and that relates directly to the feature input ticket in Story Platform for QA. And the other features, you can see there's a valid login, show my plays, register on Lucky Numbers website. So these are the exported files, but if I show you another directory, in parallel with the exported robot test cases, I have a resources directory, and the scripts reference files in this directory. So these resource files contain the definitions of the keywords used in the test cases themselves. So this is where I connect the test cases directly to the system under test using, in the example I'm showing, WebDriver Selenium commands. So you can see that every test case file, valid login as an example, has a corresponding resource file. So you can see towards the bottom of the list here, valid login underscore resource.txt is the file that contains the definitions of the keywords in the valid login test case file. These are the files that we would edit manually and debug to get our scripts working. You can see also there's at the top of this list there's a common resource that has system-wide and environment-wide kind of definitions. If you're familiar with Robot Framework, you need these to give you some very basic definitions of keywords. And you can also notice that the third file down, lkyte underscore resource, that is an application resource file. So if you like, we provide definitions at 3 levels: at a test case level, at an application level, and then an environment level. So if you recall that schematic of the way that we work with frameworks, these are the 3 levels of resource files that define the keywords. Okay, so here's an example. Let's look at input ticket.txt. So this is the test case file that relates to the feature input ticket. Now, there is just one test scenario which generates this test case, and it's not so easy to interpret what's going on in here. But if you look towards the bottom, you can see the heading, the 3 asterisks test cases, 3 test cases, invalid tickets .001, .002, .003. These correspond to the 3 rows of data in our examples. And as you read across each of those test cases, you can see that it uses a template, invalid tickets. Now, as you scroll up just before the test cases, there are some keyword definitions, and one of the keyword definitions, in fact the only one that's there, is invalid tickets. That is the template test case for the test cases that are called towards the bottom of the page. And the content of the invalid tickets test case definition corresponds to the calls to those test cases at the bottom of this page. Now you can also see in this file towards the top that every test case will reference the common resource file and a resource file which is unique to this test case file. So this is input ticket.txt. It references resources input ticket underscore resource.txt file. And that's how the structure is applied. So this file we're looking at right now is generated, and usually you would not edit it. You would not change it because it doesn't need to be changed. The editing comes from the editing effort goes towards the resource file which provides the definitions. So you can see in the template it refers to input tickets underscore resource dot input numbers. That is defined in the resource file. So in resource file input ticket underscore resource dot text, there's a keyword definition input numbers, and you can see it takes 5 arguments, and in effect each argument is processed the same way. And you can see if you read across, input text is a Selenium WebDriver keyword, a command. Plays underscore play number 3 is the identifier for a field on the screen in the system under test. It's actually, you could see it, you could track it down in the HTML for the web page you're looking at. And the $, curly brackets 3 is the third parameter. So in the call to input numbers with the 5 parameters, the third command would put a value into the third field. So input ticket underscore resource.txt, the file towards bottom right, is where we define our keywords and make the connection to our system under test. Now, I could have shown you a Windows environment running robot framework tests, but for our development and testing, we actually use Linux. So I'm just going to show you Linux. Now, robot framework works just as well, and I could have demonstrated it just the same on Windows, and I think also on Macintosh architecture as well. We choose to use Linux. So it's not so easy to see, I guess, but to the right, we have a terminal window which we can use to drive the tests. And what you're seeing there on the right, you can vaguely see the green passes, is I've just run the test. So I'm pretty certain I typed pybot space robot, and in the directory where the robot test cases exist, and the test would run. So on the right is the command line window, and on the left is the system under test. Okay, and in this case the tests have all passed, and at the end of the robot test you can see the output. There are 3 files usually produced. An output file, which is XML, it's the raw data of the log itself. There's a log file, which is an HTML web page which you can open and query, and a report file as well, which has a summary, if you like, of the test as a whole. So let's just move and just see what robot actually produces. This is the log file, and you can see in this case all the tests have passed. Towards the left in the blue you can see links which refer to the 4 test cases that we've actually executed, and you can see within each of those there are multiple test cases run within each test case file. As you scroll down the report, you can go down to every single keyword execution and look at the status of each, and it's a very handy way of debugging your tests to use the robot test log in this way. Now, that's fine and well, but how do I get the content of the output file from Robot Framework back into Story Platform for QA? There's a rather boring process, which is part of the way we run our tests, is we provide a service which you can call and post the output.xml file directly into Story Platform for QA. Now I can't really show you that because there's nothing to see. It just does it. It's a single command, and it just injects the content of the XML back into Business Story Manager, Story Platform for QA, and Story Platform for QA matches the output from the Robot Framework test to the requirements, stories, and scenarios in our product. And there are some checks done as well, of course, so you don't accidentally overwrite someone else's tests, that kind of thing. But the XML is used to provide the status of each and every scenario as executed by Robot Framework. And that's the feedback process happening. Now in Story Platform for QA, when we can look towards the right of the Robot Framework ribbon, there's a scenario test status. It's the last button on the ribbon. Clicking that will show you your list of scenarios and show you the status of each. Now in this case, you can see that each of the scenarios has a pass against them, and to the right, there's a link to the detailed content of the test execution log itself. So if I imagine I clicked on the View Test Detail, you get a dialog box which pops up and presents the detailed output from Robot Framework. And you can see for this scenario in particular, valid tickets, which passed, you can see the series of steps, the start and end time. There's a keyword-based tests. The test step, you can see there's a resource valid login, a valid login keyword defined in the application resource file. So it's valid login, go to play, input numbers, input bonus number, input number of plays, submit numbers, numbers are good, submit play at home page. And you can see each one of those steps has a pass against it, which is very convenient for me, of course. Okay, so that's how the process, the loop in the process is closed. So we can now report the status of tests against scenarios, stories, features, and requirements as a whole. Now pretty much that's the whole process end to end, and what I've tried to show you is a walkthrough from requirements on the top left of this picture down through the test execution of the system under tests in the bottom right and back again. Okay, so what we can now do and demonstrate using free services and products how you can capture requirements, stories, scenarios, automated tests, and provide that traceability back from tests back to requirements. Okay, so in summary, SpeedUp QA and Robot Framework combined support requirements of any complexity because there's a requirements management module which is not so sophisticated but provides all the core features of a requirements management product. You can capture priorities, you can create the hierarchy of requirements, it stores a change history of every requirement so you can see who changed what and when. So beyond that, SpeedUp QA implements this keyword-driven approach to test automation. So Robot Framework picks up those keywords defined in scenarios in SpeedUp QA, and by adding the keyword definitions in your resource files, you can connect the business-oriented tests directly to software in your application under test. I've shown you Selenium, Selenium/WebDriver kind of library, but there are many other libraries. There are at least, I think there are about 12 or 13 now, libraries to test different technologies. Now the acceptance-driven approach is traceable from requirements to tests and back, and we can automate story acceptance and regression testing. We can work with developers and drive their behaviors by defining tests connected directly to requirements. And the whole notion of what we end up with is a set of automated end-to-end acceptance tests with reusable keywords. I haven't shown you how to do that. All I've shown you is story-based test automation. Now each story references a single feature, typically. But if you have those keywords and the keyword definitions in your resource files, you have the building blocks to create full end-to-end tests of your application. So by having those keywords and reusing what the developers are using in their test automation, you have the building blocks to build more complex and convoluted and comprehensive end-to-end tests. Okay, so just to summarize what I've shown you and how you can access what I've shown you, the website for Story Platform for QA is SpeedUp QA. It's as simple as that. It's a subset of the functionality of Business Story Manager, and it's free to use. This is the homepage for SpeedUp QA. Behind each of the big panels are a collection of screenshots which, with some explanation of how the process works. Essentially, just to it reproduces what I've just shown you now. This is the image gallery, and each of these images can be blown up, and you can see the detail of how requirements are managed, processed, and taken through towards the test automation. So the scope of SpeedUp QA is this. What you get is the requirements module. You can create business stories and scenarios aligned with each requirement. The test scenarios are the more technically oriented tests in tester language as opposed to business language that provide you're closer to the system under test. And the robot framework interface, which I showed you, you can export your test scenarios and recover the output from robot framework test execution and import it back into SpeedUp QA. There are some limitations. It's a free service, but there are limits, of course. We limit you to 100 business stories, so you can have as many requirements as you like and as many test scenarios, but we've put a limit of 100 business stories. We're suggesting this is workable for a small team of 5 users, and you get basically one application, one project, and your 100 stories. So it should be enough to run a very small project and for free, but clearly it's a stepping stone to the full product, which I'll talk about now. Business Story Manager is a much broader, rounded, comprehensive product. So SpeedUp QA is included in Business Story Manager. We have a stakeholder and risk management module, which can do goal networks and risk management. We have an iteration, sprint, and test management module, which can manage Scrum sprints if you use Scrum. There's a dictionary and a library management, so you can upload files, you can define your business rules, terminology, and so on in the dictionary, and have it cross-referenced in the product itself. And there's also role-based access control, so you can manage people's access to stories, to scenarios, to tests, and all the features of the system are controlled that way. There are no limits on what you can use. It's a software as a service product. And essentially, we have some packages that we cover, but essentially the price is £1 per user per day. Okay, so that's the end of the talk. Before I go to the questions, I just want to mention that I'm running a session with similar content, a tutorial, at the World Testing Conference in 8th to the 12th of July in Bangalore. So myself and Susan Windsor, my business partner, are presenting 3. I think there might actually be a 4th item that we're contributing as well. But we're certainly providing a tutorial to demonstrate how business stories can be used to define and test software. So it's the business story pocketbook kind of method, if you like, the business story method. We'll do a tutorial which is basically an expansion of what we've just talked about, and I think I'm also doing a keynote on leadership with the test leaders stand-up. So I'm just going to hand over to Nitesh, I think, who is a director of Unicom, who wants to talk over and introduce the conference as a whole, and then we'll come back and I'll answer your questions. Nitesh?
Thanks, Paul. Really enjoyed your session and hope the questions will trickle in shortly. So friends, Unicom is organizing World Testing Conference, and the theme is Next Generation Testing, where we would be covering testing topics that are futuristic, innovative, and visionary. And this is the first of its kind conference in India, where the focus is more around testers than around test processes. So we have an early bird registration that is still on, that would end in 30th of April. And in this conference, we have more than 10 paid workshops. There are over 20 speakers who are coming from different parts of the world. We are also running CXO Power Breakfast, and there are 4 parallel tracks on topics like test leadership, testing in action, test innovation, and emerging technologies. So we will have fantastic topics, extraordinary speakers, and some very relevant hands-on workshops and tutorials in the conference. So there are special discounts for webinar attendees. So those who want to register for this conference, they can send us an email on support@nextgentesting.org. you can see see the email ID on the bottom left-hand corner of the slide that you can see, and as Paul mentioned, Paul and Susan will be coming from England, and they would in Bangalore for the whole of the week. So you can come and interact with them, discuss anything related to testing, not necessarily just on the topic that you heard from Paul. So Paul is one of the test evangelists, and he has large experience. And like Paul and Susan, we have test experts from various parts of the world also coming in. So come and meet Paul in this conference that is happening at Hotel Lee Meridian in Bangalore, and it's a 5-day event from 8th to 12th of July. So feel free to drop us in. Over to you, Paul. Thank you.
Thanks, Nitesh. Quite a few questions, which is great. It's always good to recognize that people are alive out there and listening. First, let me just go through them then. The first one, quite a long one. Can the robot framework be applied to batch processes too, i.e. where there is no front end and hence there is no event happening? Say like the invoice processing by a telecom company using all call details, rental charges, etc. Okay, interesting. So if you are testing, well, firstly, Robot Framework has a library. One of the libraries it has is Selenium, but it also has, as for example, a secure shell, SSH. So if you need to log on with a terminal command line to a remote server to kick off batch processes, certainly you could do that. I mean, I don't think so. Some tests would be simply just to trigger events, like kick off a batch process, whatever. In principle, you don't need Robot Framework to do that. However, if there is, the library can read the output from batch processes, and that information could be passed back into SpeedUp QA. I think the principle would be, I think I'd have to see the actual technology you were thinking of, but the test cases in SpeedUp QA could apply to any feature in any process in the software. So they could be a whole series of templates for data in large files being processed in a batch-oriented architecture. I think in principle there's no problem. Whether you need Robot Framework to do that, there's probably some value, but I think potentially most batch-oriented testing is done using shell scripts or command files, isn't it? So, okay. Next one is how different is Robot from Fresco? P-H-R-E-S-C-O. I'm afraid I've not heard of Fresco, so I couldn't possibly comment. That's an interesting one. I'll have to look that up. So Robot Framework is a test automation framework. It's one test automation framework. It's the one I'm familiar with. There's another one certainly that's becoming popular in the UK called Axe. I am guessing that Fresco is another test automation framework. I'm afraid I'm not familiar with it, so I don't think I can answer that. I'll look it up. Okay, next question. How do we look for traceability matrix? Okay, so historically we would tend to have, in a system test, we might have a column of features, and then we might have, running from left to right, a whole series of columns with references to test cases that exercise the feature on every row. Now, on the one hand, that's kind of a very valuable way of presenting things. On the other hand, it's kind of old-fashioned. Okay, so one of the things that I'm trying to encourage people to think of is that the tests associated with each feature are basically aligned with the scenarios that you create against each feature in the story. So the data to produce a matrix in Story Platform for QA is there. We have a summary of we tend not to think in terms of matrices. It kind of harks back to spreadsheets and some of the bigger test management tools which relate to how testing might have been done in the 70s almost. But I think we've got an opportunity. We can still produce that. We have the data, let me say, firstly. But also, I think the way we think about coverage is going to change soon. Because rather than just identify the features that are covered by a test scenario, we can think more deeply about the language that is used in the definition of that feature. So if we have, say, a customer ID as a business term in our glossary, and that is indexed across all the requirements and stories and scenarios and tests, we can actually do coverage reports against any concept that has been named in the glossary. So I could show a history of all the testing done against customer ID. So any concept we can name, we can demonstrate coverage against. So although the traditional, feature-based coverage matrices are kind of helpful, the process of behavior-driven development and creating scenarios directly against features and requirements to drive software development is the need for a coverage matrix of that format almost disappears. Because if you don't provide the scenarios and the tests that drive the test-driven development process, you don't have any software. So coverage, the meaning of coverage and the way we use coverage is likely to change, I think, in the next few years. Because I think we're not the only people working in this area. I think the behavior-driven development guys are definitely thinking ahead towards more comprehensive ways of demonstrating coverage. Okay, next question. Should the scripts or steps required for robot framework are supposed to be written by us, or can they be recorded? Okay, so two questions there. Who is us? So the robot scripts, I think the test scenarios are likely to be defined by testers. If those tests are implemented as user interface GUI tests, the resource files and the keyword definitions, I think, are likely to be created by testers. But robot framework can drive lower level API level tests as well. And there's no reason why you shouldn't have scenarios which drive the system on a test through the UI or at a lower level so developers can do, in effect, their unit testing in this way at a very low level. So that's part of it, and there is no constraint on who writes or uses these test cases. It depends on the resource files you create. Now the other interpretation I could put on that is, can we do capture replay? Robot doesn't provide a feature to do that, but there's certainly a little utility in SpeedUp QA which will scan the HTML of a web page and pick out the fields in forms and create an approximate test case just to list all the fields and a command to put data in each one of them. I didn't show you that, but that's it's not totally comprehensive, but it will speed the process up a little bit. So we don't have capture replay in that sense, but we do have a scan and capture, if you like, process. There's 2 or 3 more questions, but I think Mohini, am I time? Can we overrun or?
You can take those questions up.
Okay. I'll carry on, shall I?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. I apologize. What's the next one? How will we manage the automated script if requirement is frequently changed? Okay. So I haven't gone into very much detail, but we have this concept of a requirement against which stories that describe features and scenarios are created. When you're comfortable that the requirement and the stories are correct, you can lock them, at which point you can then work on the test scenarios and drive the development process using those test scenarios. Now, suppose the requirements change. Okay, so why do requirements change? Firstly, you get the requirement wrong, some knowledge is gained in the process, or the business changes their mind potentially for any reason. Okay, so the process then becomes the story is unlocked, and then the requirement and the stories associated with it can be worked on, and the tests are frozen. So when the story and business scenarios are then refined, we then lock the stories, and then the tester would say, okay, so my old scenarios might need some adjustment, and my test scenarios, the business scenarios have changed, and my test scenarios might need some adjustment, but they're dealing with a fixed requirement again. Okay, so change is inevitable. We are not providing a change management, a source control kind of process here, but we do have this concept of locking stories so that either the requirements are fluid and the tests cannot change, or the tests are fluid and the requirements cannot change. And it's kind of an either, it's a Boolean if you like. Yeah, that's kind of what we offer. Do we have any alternative to SpeedUp QA? That's a good one. I have to say, a couple of years ago, we decided to build a software product to do this because there was nothing else on the market that would do this. Now, I must say I have to go and do another review of the market and see what's out there, so I can't give you an answer directly. Certainly it's possible to do most of what I've shown you if you're prepared to write a little bit of code and to tinker with Excel spreadsheets and macros, and I'm sure it's possible. I don't right now know of any products that work the way we've proposed. There are requirements management products that can hold stories, but they do not connect to test automation frameworks. Most of them do not have a dictionary that works in the way that we've proposed. Most of them don't provide simultaneously. They tend to provide story definitions in a less structured format. So they simulate yellow stickies, if you like, on a whiteboard. So I can't honestly tell you of any products that work exactly the way we have proposed. But I think that's kind of a good thing for us, but a bad thing for the market. I'll leave it at that. Next question. Can we test mobile and desktop applications also via Robot Framework? Certainly. There is a library which will allow you to drive Java and Windows based applications, certainly, using Robot. I believe there's an Android library, so I'm not familiar with it other than I know it exists. Certainly there's a capability there to drive Android-based devices. iOS, Apple products, don't know. If you go to the Robot Framework website, if you Google Robot Framework, there's a very comprehensive homepage there with links to all manner of stuff. The libraries are listed there. I don't know off the top of my head whether and how many of these libraries there are. There's at least 12, I think. And actually creating your own library, I should say, is not that hard. I'm actually working with a proprietary tool vendor to build a library to connect Robot Framework to their product. So if there isn't one, snoop around. You might find somebody who will build one for you. Next question. Does Robot support C#? I couldn't answer that. I don't actually know. I think if you go to the Robot Framework website, you'd find that pretty quickly. Again, Robot Framework isn't our product. It's a free open source product managed by a bunch of very smart guys, I think associated with Nokia originally. Is this software free or does it have licenses? So SpeedUp QA is free. It's a software as a service. You access it through the internet. Business Story Manager has a license arrangement. We do charge for that. It's essentially £1 sterling per user per day. Next question. Hi Paul, does this Business Story Manager, can it be used for testing payroll desktop application? I think Business Story Manager is completely neutral. I mean, the story descriptions are they're in business language. They could describe any application, so there's no limit there. The Robot Framework product, I'd have to check, but you'd have to check. But Robot Framework and the libraries there should be able to test your desktop application, but you'd have to go and research what Robot Framework can do for you. It's the libraries as well. Next question. Can Robot Framework work with ALM 11? Now, I think that's referring to the HP product. If it is, the answer is not to our knowledge. We haven't done any work with HP in particular, or any other of the ALM vendors. in effect, what Business Story Manager is, it's kind of a lightweight ALM. So right now, we're not looking to collaborate with other ALM vendors because we have our own ALM product, in effect. How different, next question, how different is this from IDE, Integrated Development Environment, NUnit plus Selenium plus MS Test Manager? Right. I think the Microsoft products can't yet do requirements management the way that we envisage. Certainly, you can pull together. You can use Visual Studio products to capture stories, I believe, and certainly to do your behavior-driven development processes using structured stories. I think that can definitely be done. How different is this? Well, firstly, it's not Microsoft, so it's not developer-oriented. So we're trying to pull behavior-driven development processes up into the business analysis space. Now, historically, the Microsoft products, at the end of the day, are designed by and built for developer communities. Now, I'm going to be told I'm wrong by someone out there who's using it properly, let me suggest. But I'd say that would be the difference. That would be the difference in perspective. We're very, very much more focused on working with users to achieve business goals, not to write code. Next question. What is the difference between keyword-driven framework and robot framework? I'm not entirely sure I understand that, other than robot framework is a keyword-driven framework, so there is no difference. Robot framework, I have to say, can interpret stories written in the Gherkin format directly. So robot framework can take keywords containing, given, when, and then clauses, and it works very nicely. I've used it that way. But because robot framework simply takes language, you can put any text into your keywords. So it's still keyword driven. How different robot framework is from Concordian? Again, I've not used Concordian on a real project. My visibility of that, I seem to remember it's much more technically oriented. So whereas in robot framework you'd see almost natural language, but structured, but it's still natural language, Concordian demands that you write code. Now whether that's HTML or I have a feeling you may need to write some Java as well, but robot framework does not require you to write what you would recognize as program code or HTML directly. You can do, and occasionally there are situations where you need to write a little bit of JavaScript to access an object on screen, perhaps, to do something clever. But you have that under any circumstance for any tool that's object-oriented in terms of driving web pages. But essentially, I'd say the difference between that and Concordian is Concordian, to me, looked much more technically oriented. Programmers would be comfortable with it. I think business analysts would not. Testers, if you're technical, maybe it's okay. If you're not technical, it might be a bit scary. Next question. A continuation. Let's go. Continued on batch processing based on my feedback. I would like to know how I can configure test cases for the business rules that apply to the batch process rather than just the batch process itself. Sorry if I'm not getting across. That's okay. Okay. So within your batch processes, there would be, if you look at the batch process as one very long and very large feature, you could write stories for that, but they would be immensely complicated and probably very unwieldy. If you look at your batch processes as a series of individual smaller scale processes, individual rows of data within the content that's processed by your batch processes, I'm guessing each one of those could be represented by a test case, an example in that. So in theory, for all the variations and permutations you have for lower level processes in your batch architecture, you could identify features, you could identify test cases, and so on. the thing with batch processes is they are very much end-to-end processes, aren't they? So I'm guessing you may have not just one program which just takes one file of data at one end and just outputs stuff at the other, but there might be a whole series of data collection, manipulation, enhancement, merging, deduping, who knows, and reconciliations at the end. There might be many, many processes. The way I've described stories today really relate to features within each of those processes. So they're low-level features and low-level scenarios. However, there is no reason why you cannot take the definitions of the test cases in for each of those features and string them together in what you don't recognize as higher-level test cases. So you could probably do some manipulation in, I'm visualizing doing this in Excel. So I think the potential is there, but it's not something I've been thinking about. I'd be interested, if you want to drop me an email, I'd be interested in having a conversation with you and just hearing your thoughts, and maybe having. I should have a position on this. I don't think I've got a position that I can articulate very elegantly yet. I think I need to think this one through. But I like the question. It's a very common process, isn't it? Which scripting languages can be used to write to scripts? So within Robot Framework, you don't actually write Java or Python or C# or any of those languages. You write everything in terms of commands which the library defines. So you don't write code. So the script language is simply, it depends on the library that you are using within Robot Framework. So the Selenium library, also known as WebDriver, has keyword commands which don't look like code. They don't look like Java, and they don't have curly braces or anything like that. They are straightforward, plain English. So that's the beauty of using a framework. If you want to write Selenium, I believe, again, I've not used Selenium for a couple of years now directly, but there are several languages, and certainly Java, certainly I think C++ or C#, one of those, and maybe Python too, and so on. You don't need to get into the programming language very often at all if you're using the Robot Framework approach. Does this also support testing of the mobile apps, specifically Android and iOS apps? My suggestion would be to take a look at the Robot Framework website, and if you go to the libraries that are supported, and there's definitely one for Android. iOS, I honestly can't remember. There might be. I think even if you do, you still have to get into jailbreaking the devices to allow these things to work. But I think you have to go to the Robot Framework website there. It's quite well laid out, so I think you'll find the answer pretty quick if you go there. Next question. How would script and object repository be maintained if every now and then requirement changes, and can Robot Framework have same references to dev SVN to sync the object repository for? Okay, so I think the question is, are there any mechanisms for synchronizing code and test code to the content of Business Story Manager and Story Platform for QA? The process that I've described is it's changes in code, changes in tests are driven by changes in requirements. So one of the benefits of the approach I'm proposing here, and this concept of locking stories, is that in the past requirements would be written, not trusted, developers would build the software, testers would come along and attempt to test against requirements, but no, all along they've got to use their wits and interpersonal skills to get information to understand how to write tests. Potentially, if all changes are driven through the requirements, or certainly changes to the functionality exposed to users is driven through requirements, the synchronization is a benefit. It's not something you have to work on, if that makes sense. If you're using this concept of executable specifications, which is like one of the goals of behavior-driven development, is you have specs that you trust because they are executable. The difficulty of synchronization between code and requirements is far reduced. There's a couple of, if you do a search for redistributed testing, there's a video I think there's a video on the conference website actually. I think it's been put there at the bottom. If you go to nextgentesting.org and scroll to the bottom, there's like a 5-minute like kind of lightning talk on redistributed testing, and some of the ideas that I'm mentioning now are given a little bit of detail there. So I'd suggest you watch that perhaps. Okay, next question. Next but one. Can we achieve parallel execution like using Selenium Grid? I think there's certainly a service called Source Labs, provided by Source Labs, which allows you to run your Selenium tests remotely. I believe, but I haven't used it. It's actually next month I'm going to take a closer look at this, but I believe you can run your robot framework tests remotely using the Source Labs technologies. So I think the short answer is yes. It's not Selenium Grid, but I think it will achieve the same end. Next question. The last question, I think. Can we integrate it with continuous integration tools like Hudson? It depends what you mean by integrate it. If you are using Hudson and you have a continuous integration regime, the location of your test case files and the location of your resource files will already be under the control of Hudson. So I think the question from my point of view would be, how do you get the content exported from SpeedUp QA into your Hudson regime? One way would be to, maybe you have to write a little process which does the transfer from either a Dropbox account or can interpret an email. But we can certainly send content through email and through Dropbox. We have something, a piece of code which will write into a Subversion library, which we haven't released because we don't use Subversion ourselves, and it's kind of experimental. But we expect that we will create interfaces to other tools, other source control tools, Subversion, Git, and so on. So we don't have that yet, but talk to us. We might be able to build it for you. That's the end of the questions, I think. That's a hell of a lot. Thank you. So that was great. I'm very grateful to you listening, and if you're still out there, thank you ever so much for paying attention. I'd like to hand over now to Mahini, who I think will close the webinar.
Well, thank you so much, Paul, for the insightful presentation. I'm really thankful to you for conducting this webinar. It was indeed a great session. I would also like to thank all our participants for their support in making this webinar a success. The recording of this session would be available on techgeek.com by tomorrow. Thank you all. Have a great evening.